Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Rough and Ready, Frameworks to Measure Persistent Engagement and Deterrence in Breakers GHI. We're here to listen to Jason Healy and Neil Jenkins. Before we begin, a few brief notes as always. Stop by the business hall located on Mandalay Bay, Oceanside, and Shoreline Ballrooms on level 2. And of course, please put your phone on vibrate. It makes it easy for all of us to ignore that ringing. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Steve.
All right, thank you. How you doing? Good morning. My name is Neil Jenkins. This is Jason Healy. We're going to talk to you a little bit today about some things that we've been looking at for frameworks to look at how the U.S. government, specifically the Department of Defense, is looking at some policy actions, some potential offensive cyber operations, and then talk about some frameworks that we want to use to actually try and measure that so we can take a look at what the impacts will be. So we've talked a little bit about this in the past at CyberWarCon and at SciCon. We've been developing the framework and building it with a lot of input from the community. And this is another step to do that and to talk about some of the work we've done, some of the future work that we're doing. So if you want to go to the next. So my name is Neil Jenkins. I'm the Chief Analytic Officer at the Cyber Threat Alliance. We are a cooperative group of cybersecurity companies that have come together to share information and collaborate on operational issues. Essentially, if we're looking at the Avengers and superheroes, like each of our companies has great powers and are awesome on their own, but every once in a while we would need to come together and share that information and work together on big problems. So that's what we're doing.
I'm Jason Healy. I'm a senior research scholar at Columbia University. Good to see some of the alumni here. I've got a background. I came out of the Air Force, helped set up the first Cyber Command back in 1998, and Goldman Sachs, White House. And then helped set up a cyber program at a think tank, the Atlanta Council. I'm on the DEF CON talk review board. Oh, and I don't think it affects here, but I've seen it in some of the other conferences, in some of the other talks. If you're wearing a tie, you're in the wrong conference. That's RSA, and so no, you don't need that here. So, how many folks are familiar or seen the strategy of persistent engagement for defense and what Department of Defense is going to do? Okay, so we'll spend just a touch of time on this because it is the most significant change that I've seen in 20 years of looking at military cyber policy. And so we'll start with some of the quotes and then we'll get into what it actually means in a little bit more depth. So this was John Bolton, the President's National Security Advisor, talking about why this administration wants to do more offensive cyber operations and what they might call defensive cyber effects operations, using cyber to counter the other guy's cyber. And he's saying that we want to do this not because we want more attacks in the world, but we want to create the structures of deterrence. He said our hands are no longer tied the way they were under the Obama administration. And he said, if you look at the thing we want to deter, things like OPM or the hack by China are exactly the kind of things that we want to hit and that we want to stop. Just a couple of weeks ago, General Milley, in his confirmation testimony as the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when prompted by Senator Blumenthal, said yes, a good offense is the best defense, and that if we increase our offensive capability, then that's going to get the other side to back down. General Nakasone has put it in slightly different terms. He's the commander of U.S. Cyber Command and the director of NSA. He talks less about having the capability rather than you have to, it's just not having the capability, you must use the capability. And we're going to use the capability to impose cumulative costs on the other side. But he does agree about the best defense is a good offense, and that we have to take the fight to the enemy and take it into his and others' networks so that we're not fighting in our own networks. So it really is a very significant change from what we've seen over the previous 20 years.
And so the debate is, will this work or not? Or what are going to be the outcomes of a more kind of this persistent engagement, defend forward activity that the U.S. military is talking about doing? So there's clearly the hawkish view that a more forceful approach is going to lead to deterrence, it's going to make our adversaries more tame, and it's going to decrease the number of cyber incidents that we're having to deal with on a regular basis. The alternative is not necessarily the dovish view, because I wouldn't consider myself a dove in this area in particular, but more of an owlish view, right? Kind of we're a little more cautious and worried that the activity that the U.S. government is talking about doing may backfire and actually may lead to more attacks. If there's more offensive cyber stuff going on in the system, then is that just going to kind of create a scenario where more and more and more attacks build and build? So, but the thing is, there's little evidence either way.
Can I ask, how many folks would agree right now with the hawkish view and say we've got to be fighting back, and that's going to make things, that's going to make things better? How many would be kind of more owlish and say, well, yeah, okay. So I would say it was about maybe 2-to-1 on the owlish versus hawks, and I think that's entirely fair.
Yep. And I think that the thing that we're trying to get to is that there's little evidence either way that it's going to work that way, right? Like there's not a lot of public data that's out there about these incidents. There's not a lot of baseline that we have to build on. So we need to start collecting that. So let's fix that.
If anyone I happen to be an owl. I respect my friends that are hawks, but neither of us are working on evidence for the most part. When we're making these arguments about hawks or doves, or owls, we're largely doing our gut reaction, and I mean that's based on experience, and it's based on our history in the field, and it's based on how we think adversaries are going to respond, and that's all useful. But we've got to do better, right? We're about to start getting into a fight with Russia's Chinese military and intelligence forces, so we have to do better than that. And it comes down to, it's a policy question, right? We're getting down, this isn't just let's collect some hacker data and then let's compare. It's getting down to, are we meeting the goals of the policymakers, right? When the National Security Advisor, when General Milley are saying, all right, we do this, it's going to be getting better, we've got to look at a really large view and figure out, all right, what are the goals that they're trying to accomplish, and let's work for that. So first off, we need a structured causal theory. Like, oh, I'm an academic now, I get to say stuff like that and not sound pretentious. All I'm saying is so what's the cause and effect that Cyber Command we call them persistent engagement. This is persistent engagement. So what are the persistent engagers saying? So first they say the adversaries are trying to destabilize us, take away our power. The status quo is unacceptable. That's step 1. Step 10 is what we want. And so if you read the documents from the administration and the Department of Defense, they say we want a more stable environment and U.S. superiority. So their goal is both stability and superiority. You may not be able to get both, and so how do you get there? So the implied cause and effect is, hey, we're going to defend forward. We need to do that with reduced operational constraints. Those reduced operational constraints are both they've got a little bit more of a free hand from Congress, as well as from the White House, of saying, yeah, you need to come to us less frequently. You don't need to get stuff approved by the president. You can do more on your own. Using that and defending forward, they're going to get in and intercept and halt adversary attacks as close to the source as they can. That will help improve U.S. defenses. So, for example, if we're in the GRU's development network, oh man, that's going to give us really cool stuff that we can use to make sure that we can defend against that. If we're seeing, if we're in the enemy's command and control systems, well, that will help improve our defenses so that we can be ready for those attacks when they're going to happen. Also, by being in those systems, we are going to be directly imposing friction, right? If we see the command and control network of the GRU, we take it down, they're not going to be able to use it against us. We're not trying to do it to deter them, we're trying to do it to directly stop that attack so that it doesn't affect us. As we are affecting, in this example, the GRU network, we're not just stopping that attack, we're forcing them to rebuild those networks, rebuild those capabilities, so that they've got less money and resources to come at us. Right? If they're having to rebuild infrastructure and rebuild their arsenal, that's fewer resources than they're going to be able to deploy against us. Right? So we're reducing their ability to attack over the medium term. Cyber Command talks about this less, but it's come up in the authors of the strategy, who are some academics, and they argue there's this process of tacit bargaining, saying, look, we're never going to agree with the Russians, Chinese, Iranians, and North Koreans on the negotiating tables of Geneva about what the rules are going to be. Not going to happen, or it's not anytime soon. But the fighters in the pit, in the moment, we can figure it out. We can get in there and just wrestling and by throwing elbows around, we're going to figure out what the rules are going to be just being in the fight. Where the Chinese or the Russians with us are going to say, oh, wow, okay, that thing, you're really coming at us hard. We're going to do less of that because it's clear that you see this as a step too far. And likewise, that we'll learn what they consider the red lines. Again, not because they say it, but because we're in the fight. Separate from that is deterrence. Like you saw the New York Times article from David Sanger and Nicole Perlroth that were in the Russian power grid. Well, we're not doing that to stop their cyber attacks specifically. We're doing it because they're in our grid, and now we can have this, we're holding them at risk, they're holding us at risk, and if they go too far, they know we can take down their grid. That's separate. And so what Cyber Command and the others are saying, this is the process. If we do these things, we get to step 10 over the medium and long term, and we get stability and superiority.
And so what we want to try to do is find a way to measure this. And of course, we're not going to be able to measure it exactly. We're not talking about some kind of actual physical science here. We're talking about political science. We're looking at ways to put a framework around this so we can start looking at it and start trying to collect some information and start making some judgments and assessments of it. And so we're trying to figure out, are we going to get some negative feedback from this approach or some positive feedback from this approach? So think about the thermostat in your home, right? Negative feedback is if it gets warm in your house, the air conditioning comes on, tries to lower the temperature. So is that what's going to happen here as the U.S. government tries to do some of these defend forward, persistent engagement activities? Are they going to push a little bit, and then kind of the system, the adversaries, are they going to push back and kind of reduce the tension across the spectrum? We're going to see a decrease in these extreme events that happen, these destabilizing significant cyber incidents. Alternatively, are we going to be looking at some kind of positive feedback situation, right? Like your car driving on an icy road where if you tilt the steering wheel just a little bit, if your wheels are bad, you start to spin out in the back, right? You get a big reaction out of a small thing. Are we going to see some kind of scenario where a U.S. counteroffensive amplifies the trends and causes more of these kinds of things? We get further and further away from the previous norms. We get an increase in this aggressive behavior.
And then I have a paper that's going to be coming out in Journal of Cybersecurity that gets into the positive, negative feedback a little bit more, but you get the idea for here. DoDs in the persistent engagers are saying it's going to give negative feedback. The owls are saying maybe it might do that, but it's possible the signals from positive feedback are going to be stronger. So the government's not really saying how they're planning on measuring it. From the folks I've talked to and from what I know in my own military background, the military is going to do great at saying, all right, we want to change the adversary behavior. We've got this specific adversary group doing these specific things. So, APT, whatever, the GRU, the Ministry of State Security of China, they're going to have good operational plans to say, what can we do to stop these specific operations, these campaigns, and over how long do we expect to see that? But that's not tied to the policymaker goals, right? They didn't promise that this was going to change a few adversaries over time. They said, this is going to make the whole thing better. And you're not going to get that. I mean, this is like body count, or this is like, we're shooting at the adversaries and they're keeping their head down. Well, that's not how you win in Afghanistan or Iraq, right? You don't win by just shooting so the other guy keeps their head down. You've got to play to win, or you've got to aim for what the policymaker goals were. So there's a group called the NIC, it's the top level analytical body for the intelligence community. We assume they're going to be doing some work on this, but this can't just be the government, right? They're not going to have the data sets that we all have, and there might be a lot of motivated reasoning, right? They want to get to yes on this. They would like to find out. We're going to do like we're doing in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Oh, we're almost there, boss. Just give us another year. Just give us another couple thousand troops. We're going to win this some bitch. And so they really need folks that have our perspectives and our kinds of data sets.
And so let's talk about some of the basic frameworks we could use to start measuring this activity. We've got 3 that we outline here that we can play with. They all have their own strengths and weaknesses, but we'll walk through them in the next few slides.
Yeah, and these were in our paper, and then when we get to future work, we'll be talking about the next model that we have.
So the first one we could use is actually use what the U.S. government is using when it comes to measuring significant cyber incidents and determining whether or not something is a significant cyber incident. This is the U.S. government's incident severity schema. It's actually out public and available. It first appeared publicly in some of the material around the release of Presidential Policy Directive 41, which is about cyber incident response. And it's also in some of the appendices of the National Cyber Incident Response Plan. But the basic idea is let's look at let's look at an incident that's happening and let's make an assessment of how it impacts public health or safety, national security, economic security, foreign relations, civil liberties, or public confidence, and then make a judgment on those things. And there's all sorts of ways you can do that. There are elements of the U.S. government. I know from my time at the Department of Homeland Security, we had an actual kind of system that we could go into and plug different metrics into, like, well, how big is the entity that's been impacted? What financial impact we expect to come out of this, all these kinds of things, and it would output a number that would kind of give us somewhere on this level, and then we could kind of wing it a little bit and say, well, the number said it was a 2, but this seems to be serious enough, we're going to bump it up to a 3, and that kind of thing. And then once it gets up to that level 3, specific actions get taken, like things get stood up, interagency coordination begins to happen, those kinds of things. So we as a community could start using the schema to try and talk in the same language that the U.S. government presumably still talks in. That's going to lead to some issues, right? We may not make the same judgment when we look at an incident that the federal government may make. It may be a little too simple for this, but maybe in the first kind of first kind of times we try to do this, maybe simple's the right approach, right? Like, let's start simple, let's start learning something, let's start building on it. The other piece here, can't get any close to causation, right? Like, just because we say OMB was a 3, we can't then say, well, because it was a 3, these actions that the U.S. government took earlier, caused this to happen. So,
but I like one of the things I like about this is that the government's already doing it. So it fits with an existing process that's already run DHS and White House. So this would be a very, very easy way to do this. At least for the government side. It's not as good for us, but it's not bad for private sector. The second framework is based on that statement from Best Mustache in Government, is this one. The hacking of OPM by the Chinese is exactly the kind of threat to privacy that we're determined to deter. A lot of us have issues with the statement. The OPM was just espionage, and we've said that that's okay, but let's put that aside. Let's take this at mustache value, or face value. So let's say if we want to deter things like OPM, let's figure out what that means. All right, let's get a big bottle of booze. I'm on a gin kick right now. A big enough whiteboard, and then let's say, all right, what's an OPM-style incident? Right, it's not going to take us that long to say, well, what are the characteristics of the things that we want adversaries to stop doing to us? We include some in our paper as a start. And we just look at, all right, well, what past incidents have had those characteristics, and then we track those in a time series with the new incidents. Again, this sounds ridiculously simple, but from what we've been talking with around the community, even the simplest stuff isn't being done to the level that you'd think. And what the persistent engagers and what the hawks are saying is going to happen is something like the one on the left, that we're going to be seeing a decrease. Now, this isn't really proving correlation or causation, but this is what they're saying is going to happen. They're saying this might be the most significant thing that we've ever done in our field of information security, is the way it's being promised. Well, what happens if that doesn't happen? What if we get case 2, the one on the right, and we see a sharp increase? Then we've got an issue, right? It's not proven, neither one of these is proving it either way. But the evidence can be suggestive. Right? If they're saying this is going to be one of the best things ever and it's going to go down, and in fact we see a sharp spike, then the hawks, they've got a case to explain. Right? They're going to come up and say to the policymakers why they think that happened. And in that sense, the failure of this would be much louder. It sends a much stronger signal than the success of it. So it's still some messy. We can't get to correlation and causation. We're only going to be able to work with what's publicly known. the large-scale disruptive events, the large-scale espionage after they've been discovered. This isn't going to help us for all of the silent cyber the incidents that we're not seeing that haven't become public yet, but that's really going to, that we're going to have that anyhow in most of these. But it also does give more analytical transparency. By laying out what it is that we're counting, we all can at least agree on the direction of the curve. Oh, and that's what I wanted to say on this. The actual count may be less important than the direction of the change. Right? If it's going down, that's more important than how much or how little it's going down, which might be harder to count. If it goes way up, just that direction and magnitude can tell us a whole lot. The third one that we want to talk about is doing a deep dive on a particular adversary and a particular goal. And so for us, the red line drawn report is the best example of that, of saying, all right, we specifically want to see commercial espionage go down by Chinese actors. The other ones couldn't get into that specific level of adversary and motive and tied to the specific policy goal. We want Chinese commercial espionage going down. Well, this was a specific measurement of that. And there were issues. I mean, there's still some argument over whether this was a success or not about this particular graph from the FireEye report. And I'm saying, if we're still arguing from this, 4 years after it came out, what makes us think we're going to do much better on persistent engagement unless we do better now? So regardless of whether you agreed with the results of that report or not, there's three key questions that we got to focus on here. One, was there an actual decrease in Chinese operations or not? Maybe they just became more stealthy. That's a question for cyber threat analysts. The second question, well, maybe if it did go down, it had nothing to do with us. And this is our colleague Adam Siegel at the Council for Foreign Relations, a China expert, has said, well, maybe the Chinese wanted to do that because they saw this as corruption and they wanted to centralize things anyhow because that's what Xi wants to do. Well, then maybe our actions weren't successful even if it did go down. And that's a question best answered by the China experts, guys like Adam Siegel. Last is, well, did the decrease matter? I've heard a lot of folks that were talking about that were throwing stones at fire after this report said, well, yeah, it went down 95% or something like that, but that 5% might be really, really important. Those must be the most critical networks, and it needs to be 0 because it doesn't matter that it came down 95%. That's not ours to answer, right? That's up to the policymakers and for the others that are involved to answer whether or not that succeeded or not. So we think there's a lot of value in this, of going in for this adversary pairing and looking at the specific policy goal that we want to go forward. But we need to take these questions in so that we can be more transparent between us as analysts about what we're trying to get towards. So we've got to do this. We've got to do it with transparency. It's a lot less messy. It's tied specifically to the policy goal, but it's going to be still doing this hard to get to the specific cause and effect.
So essentially, those are the three basic frameworks that we think that we could use and work with. Like we said, strengths and weaknesses to all of them. But I think at least it gives you it gives us a place to start, right? We can start playing with them. We can start using them. We can start trying them out, see what kind of results we get out of the other end. And of course, there are shortcomings. So we thought of some of these shortcomings as we were doing the work. A lot of the people that we engage with raised them as we talk to them, and I think it's important to be clear and be upfront about what the shortcomings of this stuff of these shortcomings are. It's very clear that what we're trying to measure here can be affected by lots of things that aren't at all related to what the U.S. government and cybercom and the military are trying to do, or by what some of the kind of defenders are trying to do on the network defense side. So the effects of the U.S. actions, the U.S. actions U.S. government's trying to take, they could be swamped by these technical developments, right? We could have an increase in the number of reported incidents just because all these new classes of vulnerabilities get released, or there's a flood of new and insecure devices from the Internet of Things, which of course there are, or because we get better at detecting. We get better defense. So if we get better at detecting and get better at reporting incidents, it's going to look like there are a lot more incidents. That can be confusing to this kind of analysis. It could also be that we could start deploying more secure infrastructure. We could start doing better on the defensive side, and that's going to actually end up leading to fewer attacks. That's going to drive the adversaries in different ways, but it's going to kind of affect what we think of as the measurement here, right? So one of the things we could do to kind of control for that is to check these competing hypotheses by comparing the trend lines between the adversaries. Like look at a trend line of what's happening with Iran, look at a trend line of what's happening with China. If they're moving in opposite directions, then it's probably not a global effect that's causing that change. It could also be that, many of these attacks and the adversary motivations are hidden. The data is going to be hard to come by and analyze. I think any of you that work for a cybersecurity vendor know how difficult it can be sometimes to find this data, to know what you have, to know what everybody else has, put all that stuff together. It could also be that geopolitical events cause adversaries to change what they're doing, right? It could become some kind of pressure on a government that causes them to say, well, either that pressure is going to cause them to either decrease the amount of cyber incidents they're doing or increase the amount of cyber incidents they're doing, right? This is all a complex situation of cost and benefit that's going to impact the folks' decision making. So how do we control for that? Well, we just need to understand that having the exact enumeration of what's happening in each of those categories matters less than the direction, like Jay said. So if we're looking for direction, especially that upward trend, if we're seeing an upward trend, that should send off alarm signals for the persistent engagers. And then finally, there's some methodological factors going to hinder this. Timescale, right? Like how often are we talking about a cyber incident that was just discovered that actually began 2 years ago? Right? It's going to be very hard to either disentangle that from a government action or to look at it in 3 years and say the actions that the U.S. government were taking in 2019, were having these effects when we can't always catch and find the incidents at the same time. And then you also have like the problem of small numbers, right? If we're only looking at the significant incidents, we're only talking about significant incidents, and you have 2 of them, and you have 2 the next year, that's an increase of 100%. That looks like a lot, right? So you have to be very careful with the decision making the way we do these. So what do we need to do? Well, we can try to appropriately structure the framework. We can try to code the data a little better to make sure that doesn't happen, or if at least if it does happen, we understand it. And then of course the other one is to just give up and not try to measure it at all, because no strategy can have any kind of measurable effect. But I think it's worthwhile trying.
Yeah, and if I can jump on that last one, one of the things I get to do is I give a twice a year, there's a group of generals that get together at one of the Air Force bases, and they just get 2 days kind of academic atmosphere to learn more about cyber, and I get to give a version of this talk down there. And I had this Air Force chief start saying, yeah, you're not going to be able to measure this at all. This is just impossible. Why are you even trying to measure it? I'm like, dude, it's not my strategy, right? It is your strategy, right? If this is the question for General Nakasone, not for me, right? If you, General, think this is so hard to measure, then why are the 4 stars and the John Boltons of the world being so sure that this is going to work when the measurement of success and failure is going to be so chaotic and so difficult? And of course, we don't think it's worth giving up. We think you can do a good set of work on it. So what we've talked about so far is what is in the paper that came out. It's an IEEE. We wanted to say, all right, let's dive in and what's our next work going to be? And so one is, I don't know if we'll do this, but I think it'll be a good paper for, I don't know, folks at Flashpoint, to say, all right, so what can we learn for kinds of conflict that are similar to this, where the adversaries are in constant contact, and what can we learn from that? For example, anti-submarine warfare, espionage. During the Cold War, we would fly bombers at the Soviet Union, then fly bombers at us. We would be specifically try to look aggressive, so they light up their radar so that we could learn about what they were going to be like. So you had this active belligerence between participants over long periods of time, and I think there's something that we can learn from that. But where we really want to be doing our work over the next year is saying, all right, if we want to try and figure out what the impact of disruptive operations are going to be, let's look at past disruptive operations and pull those lessons out. Now, this is going to be illustrative only, so.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what do we do from this perspective? Well, I think there's a couple of different ways that we can try to tackle it. There's the harder version where we try to develop the actual causal hypothesis of what makes some of these disruptive actions that network defenders or the federal government can take what makes those actions more successful against certain adversary groups and certain operations, or a little slightly more modest, and like we can study those past disruptive operations that have happened, look at that as a guide in the future as what to expect, and some of the kind of set some upper bounds on what to expect from some of the persistent engagement and defend forward operations. So kind of from a broad analytical assessments, how do we want to put, how do we want to categorize these things? So when we're talking about some of these disruption actions, we can look at them from how kind of passive they are to how active they are. And what we mean by passive, at least kind of in our first draft of thinking about this, are kind of what are the actions that network defenders take on a normal basis, right? When a cybersecurity company like Talos or Symantec or FireEye put out a report that's got a bunch of indicators and explain what an adversary group is doing, what kind of effect does that have, right? It's out in the environment, it's available for people to leverage, it's available for cybersecurity vendors to put into their systems and protect their customers, it's available for some owners and operators of systems to take those indicators, put them in themselves. That kind of has a very passive role, right? Like you're putting information out there and then you're waiting for others to take it and do stuff with it. All the way up to the active end of the spectrum, right? So actually going after the adversary groups through an offensive cyber, counter offensive cyber operation, maybe an indictment, maybe the U.S. government sanctions them, that kind of more active activity. You also want to look at the kinds of disruption. Is it just have a minor effect on the adversary or a big effect? And how often are you doing it? Was it a one-off drop of information, or is it kind of a steady drip of information, or is it something that's sustained and happening over a period of time? We also want to look at the duration of the disruption, right? How often or for how long was the adversary group disruptive? How long does it take them to return to their initial operating capability or their full operating capability? Did it take days to weeks, months to years, that kind of thing? And then what were the potential reasons for the delay, right? Was the delay in getting back up to FOC because they had technical issues, right? Did they have to go back and reestablish their infrastructure? Did they have to go buy new IP addresses? Did they have to rebuild their malware from scratch? And that's why it took them so long to get back up. Or was it some kind of combination of behavioral, bureaucratic, or political things, right? From the political spectrum, was the government that was endorsing this activity embarrassed massively? And so they said, okay, stop. Like my intelligence collection group, I want you to stop doing what you're doing and don't do it again for 6 months, right? Like that doesn't have anything to do with the technical side. They could have just flipped some switches, switched over some infrastructure, gotten back on, but they were told by their political leadership, don't do this anymore. So we want to look at a couple of different frameworks for these types of incidents. So in this talk, we'll talk a little bit about some possible uses of these case studies around adversary and campaign groups and malware and ransomware. But we could also do this for botnets. We could do this for DDoS campaigns as well. So one of the illustrative examples is the oil rig group. So recently, someone, not entirely clear who, if it was an insider, if it was a government, if it was some group of network defenders, or just somebody who found this stuff and wanted to out it. But someone got oil rigs tool set, put it out there for everybody to see, exposed all of their tools, all of their infrastructure, made it publicly available. That was a pretty big, massive event that happened to the oil rig group, right? Like if everything you have in your tool set is suddenly exposed, what are you going to do about it? Or how do you react to that? So what we saw in reality was a pretty significant disruption that happened to them, but it was, kind of on the time scale of weeks to months, right? They got outed, all of their stuff got outed, they went quiet for a while, but we started to see them come back. We started to see them take some different actions and do some different things. They may not be back to full capability yet, but this kind of framework can help us at least put some bounds on that.
Yeah, and so oil rig got just so comprehensively screwed, right? Everything they had was out. If they come back in 3 months, that gives us an upper limit of what we can expect from cyber command disruption operations, right? If you hit someone that comprehensively and it only slows them down for a single quarter, well then we shouldn't be expecting that much of persistent engagement. But if rather they just disband they just kind of stop their operations and they just go off and do other things, or they just go off into different groups, then that might teach us something different. Like, all right, if you really hit them hard. And by the way, shout out to Ken Wolf of Standard Chartered that gave us this example and really helped us think through this part of this research. APT1 is another example, right? And this is what we think we have these natural experiments, right? We can look at these different disruption operations and hopefully there's enough of them that we can really take lessons out of them. APT1 was significant. It was periodic, right? There was stuff coming out on APT1, not just the Mandiant report, right? That was a significant one-off, but there was a lot of other disruption operations, including active disruption operations, that were happening across time of what was happening to APT1. And we did see a disruption of months, right? Folks were saying I saw anywhere from 6 months to a year, depending on what they were trying to count, of how long APT1 was down before they came back. Now, some of that was certainly due to the technical factors, right, of just getting the infrastructure burnt, of just having all their IOCs that were out there and widely shared, on the front page of the New York Times. But clearly it seemed like there was political or bureaucratic reasons for this also. Feeling burnt, not wanting to have them come back out. They probably could have come back technically a lot more quickly than they did. And so that's why we have this factor of these non-technical reasons to help us pull out, to help us understand that. We're not always going to know it, but when we do have it, we think it's a good factor to have in there for modification. Looking at malware, and by the way, these are just illustrative. If you don't agree necessarily with the conclusions and the way that we've categorized it, we just wanted to have this material for Black Hat. We'll be doing more of the research over the coming year. Conficker was our example for malware. Right, you had this very active disruption operation that was going on for years of the Conficker working group. Remember that's 2011? Where they were doing everything they could to stop Conficker from spreading any farther. But each time they do this really significant operation to fight it, it really only took weeks for the authors of Conficker, we still don't know who they were, to respond to that, come out with another version of Conficker that would bypass those defensive mitigations. So here they were doing this technical disruption and there was just no delay from the other side that seemed due to behavioral, political, or bureaucratic reasons. They were coming back quickly each and every time. So our timeline for this work, we're really enthusiastic for this part because as far as we know, there hasn't been any kind of general model for looking at these disruptive operations and then just seeing what's been effective and what hasn't for how long and trying to come up with some reasons. So we're going to be doing this, hopefully presenting at CyberWarCon 2, which is going to be in November in the Washington, D.C. area, to develop out these categories and some of these cases. Also at Columbia University, we have a capstone program where the students do research. And we're hoping that this is going to be one that we do with, for capstones, we have some of the students get in and develop these out, and we'll have that as a separate report, and we'll hopefully do it as another SciCon paper coming out next summer.
And so, I think we wanted to end today with a call to action because a lot of what we're doing here is just proposing some frameworks, and then we want people to start using them. So, if you are one of these folks who believes that this new offensive posture is going to make it more difficult, especially if you're a network defender, or especially if you're someone who works at a cybersecurity vendor, if you think that this posture is going to make it harder for you to defend the people that you are being paid to defend, then let us know. Let the community know, right? You should be talking about it. You should be blogging about it. You should be tweeting about it. And the really key part is if you include some data along with your opinion, then policymakers are more likely to listen to you. That's something that I learned when my time in government. So I think that's something that anyone can learn who has to talk to and brief up and drive things for an executive level audience. So do something. How can the network defense community help? You can help us pick the best frameworks. You can help develop them. You can, most importantly, use them. The more folks are using them, the more we can try them out, the more we can see what needs to be fixed. Share your results openly with the community, whether it's in a trust group or, I think preferably publicly blog about it if you can, via blogs, reports, that kind of thing. But the key part here is If we don't start measuring now, we'll just be that much further behind when we need to really kind of have some evidence to show some policymakers and some executives that, here's what's actually happening as an outcome of your work.
And so a lot of the reasons that we've been disagreeing over the past, disagreement is great. We should be disagreeing. But what's bothered me is we haven't been transparent enough about where the disagreements are. And that's what we're trying to do with the frameworks, right? We're trying to make clear why you think what you think and why I think what I think. What evidence helped get me to this point? And if we can be more transparent, then we have a better chance of being able to find the truth. I was going to say of convincing each other, but convincing each other isn't necessarily the issue. It's, I wouldn't even say truth, trying to be more correct than we are and that we have been. And if we can try and be more correct by showing our evidence, by showing our work, then we'll be a lot better off. Because this is really potentially really dangerous, this direction we're going in, right? We're saying that the way to get peace, the way to ensure that the internet is going to be secure is by getting engaged in a never-ending fight with the uniformed military services of nuclear armed powers, right? The time for opinions of what we think is going to work or not work, that's past, right? We now need to get in as a community and saying, all right, let's be transparent and let's really try and figure out if this is helping or not. Because right now we're letting the government grade its own homework. And that's not right. That's not why we're doing things like Black Hat, because we say, let's just trust the government and their classified sources to figure this out. So with that, thank you. Any questions? We've got microphones or...
Whenever I read anything about defending forward, one of the biggest concerns I always have is the attribution problem, right? If someone shoots a Scud missile at you, it's usually pretty easy, A, to figure out who shot it, and B, whether or not they were operating under the authorization of their command and control structure. And neither of those things are true in cyber necessarily. Like, it'd be pretty trivial for the GRU to compromise the Chinese infrastructure and use that to launch operations against the United States to trigger the United States to go after China, right? So I'm wondering how you're going to factor attribution into this framework.
Yeah. I think that's more important for the Cyber Command folks as they're doing the operations to make sure they're factoring that in. So I have one that I've got good continuity, right? They've been watching them for a while. Because this isn't, I don't consider this hackback. Right? They're not saying you're going to hit us, we're going to hit you. They're saying we're going to get into your infrastructure, and if we are following this GRU target and they are pivoting from a system in Turkey to a system in the Netherlands, that they now have the authority to follow the Russians into that system in the Netherlands, and then when it's the right time, we lock them out of their malware, or we do a takedown of the command and control. So for them, the attribution is less important for that kind of operation, because they're directly seeing the malware. So for those ones that are on the lower numbers when I was giving that 1 through 10, like of just causing friction, hey, whether we're causing friction to the Russians or the Chinese doesn't matter that much. And for some of these measurement frameworks, it also doesn't matter. Either way, we do the takedown, and theoretically the number is going to be going down because we're disrupting either the Russians or the Chinese. Either way, we win. Now, as we're getting to the higher end of saying, all right, we need to not just disrupt the specific infrastructure, but when we're talking about the tacit bargain and the other parts, then these attributions, the false flag, attribution's been getting easier and easier for the US, but it can go the other way. It can get harder and harder, and you're right, that would put the argument of persistent engagement under a lot more pressure, and it would put some of the measurement, like the that third one that we talked about, the FireEye red lines drawn, that would complicate those more specific measurements.
Yeah. No, that's fine.
Any others? Okay, yeah, we got one.
Hi, Charlie Mitchell with Insight Cybersecurity. I was interested in your take on some of the actions being aimed at Chinese companies like Huawei, and both the deterrence value that you may see in that and the security value in going after these specific projects or specific products. And I understand in terms of context that today DOD and GSA put out their rulemaking on banning the purchases of these products across the government enterprise, and they're trying to ban the purchases in the private sector as well. What do you think of as the effectiveness of this?
You want to take that one? I mean, I think in some ways it's kind of separate and apart from this specific DoD-focused activity that we've been talking about, and is much more closer to a whole of government-based approach that could be used for security. I think there's a lot of reasons there of why you would be taking those actions against Huawei and some of those companies, and they're not necessarily just cybersecurity focused, but.
Yeah, I'll bet, it took me a long time to get on the government's, for me to understand all of their arguments, because I don't think the government's been really good about talking about 5G, in these other issues. I'm sure this fits together in the White House strategy. This probably fits together in Bolton's mind of saying, yes, we're gonna do these military operations over here. That's gonna worry about the Chinese, but we need to worry about the Chinese on not letting the student, be more cautious on Chinese students coming in, be more cautious on immigration policy, be more cautious on what technology we're allowing in, because if we stop the Huawei gear coming in now, then that saves us trouble of the active operations later, because they won't even be in the infrastructure to begin with. So I don't know that they've ever really laid that out that much. Even in the White House strategy, I don't think they laid that out. But I think it's a reasonable argument to say that these are all, our hands are untied and we're going to be much more active. The DoD, or the National Security Strategy was talking about the return of great power competition. And so I think this all fits in that silo of being more active and contending with our adversaries in great power competition. It would be nice if they came out and kind of said that a little bit more clearly. But I think we'll leave it at that. Thanks, Charlie. Okay, we might have time for one more, or we will just call it there. And we call it there. Thank you very much for your time.